Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is going to be holding a conference decolonising animals in New Zealand in 2019. Have you been checking out the details of the conference? It's going to be an absolute cracker. I strongly encourage you to think about getting yourself over to New Zealand for the next ASA conference. But meanwhile, you can become a member of ASA by going to their website. Membership is just $50 Australian, and you can also follow them on Facebook. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, our other sponsor for this episode is MC Pony. Now, MC Pony has been a sponsor now for a few weeks, so I've been talking about her music for a while now. Have you followed my instructions? Have you been to her website, Vegan Enthused? The address is in the notes for this episode. MC Pony is a hip-hop artist and songwriter. She's very passionate about animal issues, and she would love you to check out her work. She's not doing this music for nothing. She wants people to listen and enjoy it. So if you're interested in music and you're interested in animals, check out MC Pony. Right, let's get down to the important business of the day. I'm at the University of Sheffield. I'm just looking out the window. I've got a beautiful view from my office, beautiful trees, beautiful old buildings. Yesterday it rained like absolute crazy. I thought we were all going to be flooded out. But today the sun is almost peeking through the clouds and we're starting to dry off. So a big improvement on yesterday at the University of Sheffield. But despite the weather, it's very good to be here because I have the opportunity to interview people who I might otherwise not come into contact with. And this week's episode is no exception. So this week I'm joined by Dr. Jared Margulies. Now, Jared, I know we just talked about how to pronounce your surname, but there's something wrong with me. That information leaves as soon as I finish the conversation. Could you please correct me or give us the pronunciation?
We can use Margulies.
Margulies?
Yeah. Jared
is a Post-Doctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Politics at the University of Sheffield. And today we're going to discuss his article, The Production of Human-Wildlife Conflict, A Political Animal Geography of Encounter, and it appeared in the journal Goeforumin. That was published in 2018. And I also want to give a shout out to Jared's co-author, which is Krithi Karanth.
Yeah, Krithi Karanth.
Krithi Karanth. Welcome to the podcast, Jared.
Thanks very much.
So why this article? What inspired it?
Sure. Well, I was doing my primary dissertation research in South India in 2015, and I'd been visiting this part of India for almost 7 or 8 years now, but I was living there for about 10 months, and my primary research was about looking at narratives around this notion of human-wildlife conflict, which was a sort of narrative framing that a lot of conservation organizations, but also the sort of state, in particular the Indian Forest Service and Indian Forest Departments, use to describe the sort of increasingly fraught and negative relationships and interactions between humans and wildlife. And that often looked like things like cattle depredation or livestock being attacked or killed by carnivores, or crop raiding by elephants or wild boar. And I was really interested in what those discourse around human-wildlife conflict, how that was sort of mobilized and used for sort of exclusionary conservation planning and policy. And after about 6 months of doing that research, I felt like I was sort of hitting that theoretical saturation point. I'd been doing lots and lots of interviews, mostly with Indian Forest Department, but also with farmers and agriculturalists in the area. And kind of felt like I had gotten to the point where I was like, okay, I think I don't need to keep asking the same sorts of questions about the sorts of problems people have with animals, or what are the sort of foundational causes of these conflicts. And then one day I noticed, just walking along, and I was talking to someone I'd interviewed a number of times, that he actually owned more than one breed of cows. And I don't know why I hadn't really ever noticed that difference before, or maybe I had noticed the difference before, but it hadn't occurred to me as something very interesting. And I asked him, and I said something along the lines of, oh, why do you have these two different kinds of cows? Does that mean anything? And he turned to me with this sort of knowing smile, and he said, oh, well, it's because everything here is changing. And at that point, I sort of had a panic attack and a mental breakdown because I realized I'd been asking the wrong questions all this time. But I think it speaks to the sort of beauty of inductive kind of long-term field work. And so from there, I started asking lots of different kinds of questions. And what I uncovered was that in asking new kinds of questions about cattle breeds, instead of asking questions about tigers and leopards and elephants, instead focusing on these sort of mundane domestic species, I was able to sort of unravel this very different complex story about why people's relationships with wild animals, in particular carnivores, were changing, and also how this was in turn also changing the sort of geographies of encounter between livestock and people, and also these animals.
Wonderful. Well, Jared, I really enjoyed your paper and I found it terribly interesting. There's a lot of different things I want to ask you about, but you used a particularly complex methodology. Could you start by telling us a little bit more about the methods you used?
Sure, and I think the methods I used sort of speak to this fact that it was something that unraveled over a long period of time. But essentially, once I started realizing I needed to pay more attention to these cattle breeds, I started trying to collect as much demographic information, not just about the different kinds of people in this landscape, but the actual different kinds of cattle. And so I started collecting data on cattle census information and interviewing local veterinarians to get information from them about what kinds of breeds people had in these areas and how that had been changing over time. And so then I was able to couple this information about sort of longitudinal data about what kinds of people were able to own which kinds of cows and how that was changing very dramatically over time in just a span of about 10 years, and couple that with the sort of in-depth interview research that I'd been doing for, going on for 7-8 months at that point.
So what did the breed story tell you about this issue?
Good question. I think a couple of things. One, the way in which it's really something I think that I'm excited about, and we're seeing increasingly in the literature, is thinking about sort of this idea of animals as lively commodities in a way that we can think about how capital moves through animal bodies in the way that people invest money in sort of livestock, in the labor they produce, but how that's not the same thing as sort of what we might think of as everyday commodities, in the sense that these are still animals that have their own sentience and capacity to act, and they produce their own kinds of spatialities and geographies. And so the sort of main take-home point of this work was that people historically in this landscape had grazed or paid people to graze this native breed of cow that's this very hardy, they call them sort of like scrub cows is a sort of colloquial term for them, but it's a really hardy kind of cow that doesn't need a lot of attention or care, but people would graze large herds of them through what is now Bandipur National Park in this particular paper, which is a wildlife conservation landscape. And for a long time, people would graze these cattle through there, but the real money in these cattle was their dung, which was sold for fertilizer. Over time, there became an increasing market and demand for this dung for coffee plantations as coffee prices globally were increasing. And so it was interesting to see in this paper how these sort of global commodity chains came to really impact this local landscape. Over time, as more and more people started grazing more and more cows, it started to have a negative impact on the wildlife landscape. And so the Forest Department started enforcing laws that were already on the books but just weren't enforced before, essentially saying you can no longer graze these animals in the park. And this had a dramatic impact on people's livelihoods, because this was essentially a landscape where a lot of people don't own their own land or have very, very small parcels of land. And these are very extensively grazed cows. So essentially they had to get rid of these animals. And so What some people were able to do who had access to capital or the capacity to take out loans was started to invest in what are known as hybrid cows, which are essentially European dairy cows crossbred with these native Indian cows. These are much more capital intensive livestock to keep. They require a lot of veterinary visits. They're much more sensitive to the climate, which is very hot. So, you've essentially got Jersey cows living in South India. So they have a lot of inflammatory issues. They also require a lot more feed and maintenance and care. So basically they cost a lot more money to keep, and only certain kinds of people in this landscape were able to essentially transition from this extensive grazed cattle economy into this more intensive one. At the same time, this produced new geographies of encounter between wild carnivores like tigers and leopards and these animals, because suddenly, instead of these cows going out and grazing in the sort of national park and potentially one of a large herd of cows maybe getting attacked by a leopard or a tiger on occasion, suddenly these attacks were happening closer and near to either the village or people's homes, where people were keeping these cows at night. And so the spaces in which people were experiencing these conflicts was becoming much more close to home, in a space that was considered sort of more a human and social space rather than a sort of quote unquote wild space. And this was really changing how people felt about those interactions. But in particular, there was a real economic burden being placed on losing one hybrid cow worth much more money than one of these extensively grazed scrub cows. And so the economic impact of a cow like that being attacked was much more significant and had compounding effects, because these were also dairy cows. So rather than being kept for their dung, they were being kept for their milk. And so once that cow was attacked, injured or killed, suddenly it wasn't just the loss of that cow, but the everyday income of selling milk was suddenly lost as well. So the economic impacts were really compounding and were becoming quite severe. And that was just something that wasn't really coming up in the narratives, in the interviews I was doing with Forest Department officials about why there was increasing conflict. And in those interviews, a lot of the Forest Department staff would really focus on what they felt like were changes in people's sort of cultural and religious tolerance for living with wild species. And my research just suggests that that's simply just not the case.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I'm a political scientist, and one of the things that really resonated with me reading your article was the problems that people encountered from a bureaucratic perspective when they tried to claim reparations for lost cattle. And, what that says to me is it's not just about a free-living carnivore coming in contact with a domestic animal. It's about the political structures that we put in place to mediate people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. The way that compensation works in India is quite complex and very frustrating for a lot of people. So in addition to the fact that compensation rates are below the actual value of these animals, the amount of time and effort it takes to file for compensation can be essentially negate the value of even applying for it in the first place. It also puts the onus on the state in terms of who's responsible. And I sort of have conflicting feelings about that as well, because I do wonder sometimes in the long term if this compensation system is really sustainable, in the sense that if animals are seen to be essentially owned by the state and the responsibility of the state, then I wonder how that will sort of have long-term knock-on effects in terms of how people think about their relationships with animals. At the same time, in this particular landscape, which is an exclusionary wildlife space, that exclusion of people from this landscape in the name of wildlife has really negatively impacted a lot of people's lives. And so for, I think, that reason, the state does have a responsibility for sort of the financial losses that people incur as wildlife populations in this space continue to increase. But yeah, it's a very frustrating scenario. It's a very frustrating issue for a lot of people on the ground, because they feel like essentially that the harms that are that they're experiencing aren't aren't being addressed by the sort of bureaucratic state. And so yeah, there's mounting frustration about that.
So am I right in thinking that the conclusion you reached is not that, modernity has arrived to these places, people would rather be on Facebook than dealing with wildlife issues? That's not the case. It's something about the changing political landscape that's affected attitudes?
Yeah, I think essentially what what I found doing this research was essentially that this is a political economy issue, and it's an issue of undemocratic forest governance, essentially, where essentially people who had a particular kind of livelihood strategy no longer have access to that. And that wasn't a decision that they were involved in making. It was something that was imposed on them from above. And so I think people are going to understandably react negatively to that. And at the same time, this was something that was, very much having a direct insignificant negative impact on people's livelihood strategies and their sort of resilience to dealing with issues. So for instance, by way of example, when people used to raise extensive scrub cows for dung would be stockpiled in sort of times of financial need. So it was essentially a way of capturing money. A lot of these are people who don't even necessarily have access to a bank account, let alone the capacity to take out loans and that sort of thing. And so literally, you had an investment being stored in dung that could later be sold when times were tough, in the same way that someone might keep a goat and sell it on for that reason as well. And the switch to dairy cows really complicated that, because you have to sell milk every day. And you can't store it and you can't save it. And that really changes how people's economies. And so the narratives I was hearing from a lot of interviews I did with bureaucrats about the fact that they would say, oh, these are people who are becoming more modern. They just want to move to the city. They aren't willing to protect their crops at night. They're becoming lazy. That's why we're having more and more of this conflict. It's because people used to care about wild animals and respect their space, and now they no longer do. And I just really, I found very little resonance with that in the interviews that I did. I think the interviews I did with people in this landscape suggest that people still care and share those values of living with these species. I mean, if they didn't, then these species wouldn't really be there anymore. I think it's such an ancient landscape of people living with animals, and they have forever. And so I just didn't find purchase with that, with that narrative.
Well, I think any of us, if we suddenly went from being in a position of stockpiling dung to having to walk into town to deliver milk every day, we might find that we are less inclined to want to stay up all night guarding our herd either. So, So, look, thank you so much for doing that research. It's absolutely fascinating. It's wonderful to hear another side of the story. Now, Jared, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I hope I'm ready.
Now, I'm not sure if you necessarily identify as an animal studies scholar, so we can adapt the questions a little bit to think more in environmental terms or geographical terms. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I think my professional answer is probably, I got a lot out of the first time I read Jacob von Uxel's A Foray into the Worlds of Humans and Animals, or Animals and Humans, I forget the order, as a way of really thinking about recentering how we approach thinking with animals. I think in terms of the actual first pro-animal scholarship I ever read, I'm gonna die on this hill, but I'm gonna go ahead and say Ferdinand the Bull by Munro Leaf, which was a children's book I read. I don't remember if my mom gave it to me, but it's essentially about a bull who doesn't want to fight in the bull ring in Spain. And I think that actually was probably really my first pro-animal scholarship that I read.
Yes, quite a good movie as well. Have you seen the movie?
Yeah, it's good.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That one's harder because my relationship to thinking about this stuff is always about human-animal relationships. So in some ways, I might say that this piece, in a certain level, I do think that this is a pro-animal scholarship piece of work. It's just that it's about getting into that complexity of the sort of contestations that animals get enrolled in.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar, or perhaps a scholar more directly in your field, who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So I actually recently attended this workshop at the University of Edinburgh on animals and social difference in nature. And I might not be the first person on your podcast to say this, but Claire Jean Kim gave the keynote address, and it was really phenomenal. And the way she sort of brings critical race theory to bear on animal studies scholarship, I think, is essential and really timely and important. So I'm gonna go with her, because I hadn't come across her work until very, very recently, and now I just it's really been inspiring for me to draw on that and learn from it.
How wonderful. And she's going to be a guest of the Shark Tales University of Sheffield Animal Studies Group in November.
So, okay. I didn't know that. How excellent.
Yes, you'll be able to hear more from her, more of her fabulous work. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think in academic terms, I think, and I do think that there's movement in this direction, but really thinking with animals as sentient actors with the capacity to do things and co-produce social worlds, and that's something I'm trying to do more and more in my work, and not thinking of that as sort of fringe, but as something that is just really long overdue.
Wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I'm going to go with capitalism, because I do think, I know it's silly to say that, but I think that it kind of, capital shoots through our relationships with the animals in so many ways in terms of how they're rendered as commodities, which I think is a practice that, it really sets the stage for how we think about our relationships with animals. And I think that is sort of foundationally at the cause of why there's so many issues around sort of injustices against animals and violence.
Mm. Well, Jared, what are you working on next?
I'm working on plants.
Okay.
I'm continuing to write about animals
Yes.
in my work in India, but I actually, in my postdoctoral research now, I'm actually doing, I'm taking a little pause from the world of animals to look at the even crazier and interesting world of plants. And so I'm doing a project on illegal wildlife trade of rare dryland succulent plants.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, no doubt. I mean, we should tell people that you're part of the big research project at the University of Sheffield on poaching and all things related. It's called BioSec, Biodiversity and Security. And no doubt what is happening to plants will have some impact on the lives of non-human animals as well, I would have thought.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see. I still am looking at doing another about 9 months of field work for this project. And so it'll be interesting to see where those sort of intersections come up.
Yeah. So how can people find out more about your work?
I'm on Twitter sometimes at Jared Margulies. And other than that, I don't have a very focused Twitter account. It's kind of all over the place. But otherwise, I have a website, jaredmargulies.com.
Yeah,
That'll work.
wonderful. And people can also check out the BioSec website for more about the project overall. Well, Jared, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. Knowing Animals is also on Facebook and Instagram. And as I say every week, and I think most people ignore me, you also could help the podcast greatly by leaving a review at iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.